feel free to take notes or not take notes and just watch. You have all this stuff at different places. The number one for your response on the AP macro is almost always based in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It could start with, imagine that the economy is in long-run equilibrium. That means that we're in this equilibrium of full employment, an equilibrium price level, and then there's an exogenous shock. Like if I was writing a problem, there's an exogenous shock that makes the price of all inputs higher. That shifts the aggregate supply either to the left or up. Notice that the price level goes up. And that's cost push inflation. Output is less than full unemployment's output. So something needs to happen. First off, nothing could happen. If nothing happens, there exists unemployment. If we're not producing as much as we could, that means that there's some capacity that's left unfilled, which means that there are some workers that are like, hey, I'll work, and the businesses are like, no thank you, we don't need you. There's not enough aggregate demand for you. One thing that could happen, and I'm not going to draw this up here, but one thing that could happen is if there are more people willing to work than jobs, it's unemployment, but imagine that the going rate's $15, and Andrew's like, hey, I'm not working, I'll work for $14. And Torque's like, yeah, I'll work for $13, it's better than being unemployed. That brings down the wage because now I'm going to lay off John, who's getting $15 an hour, and hire Torque, who's going to get $13 an hour. It's going to bring down the wage. Wage is the input for aggregate supply and shifts the aggregate supply back. How much? Who's to say? But it shifts aggregate supply back. It's the same argument for steel and iron. If there's some shock that causes iron or steel to be more expensive, which shifts the aggregate supply curve for anything that uses that input, then there's like, well, there's too much extra iron and steel around. They're going to lower that price. The input doesn't. My point is the input doesn't have to be labor. Or fiscal or monetary policy, right? Because like the government's going to be like, I'm not going to wait for like contracts to expire and wages to go down because maybe John signed a 3-year contract, so John's going to get paid $15 an hour for 3 years before I can fire him and hire Torque for $13. But by the time that happens, a new Congress and everything. So remember, aggregate demand is just GDP, which is consumption plus business investment plus government spending plus net exports. The government could use fiscal policy to shift aggregate demand. They don't know how much they're shifting. They'd love to shift it all the way here and get it back into long-run equilibrium. But they could shift it this way by using what's called discretionary policy, which means we're going to vote on a budget that has more public works. Or they could vote for tax cuts for people. to increase consumption. But maybe there's not enough votes in Congress to get that done, to approve fiscal policy. So instead, the nonpartisan Federal Reserve Bank says, hey, look, here's the money market. Here's the demand for money. Here's the interest rate. And here's the money supply right now and the current interest rate. If the Federal Reserve wants to stimulate growth, get us towards full unemployment, and increase aggregate demand, monetary policy can impact investment and consumption by lowering the interest rate. A lower interest rate occurs when the money supply increases. Lower interest rate, businesses are like, well, I need to open another building. I need to borrow money to buy like more ovens and more stoves and more pots and pans and tables because I'm a restaurant. So the interest rate is lower, I'm more likely to buy that. Consumption is driven also by interest rates. If you're going to buy a car that costs $25,000, are you more likely to buy it when the interest rate is 10% or when the interest rate is 3%? You're more likely to buy it when the interest rate is 3%. So that would stimulate aggregate demand with that low interest rate, and that would shift it, boom, as well.